If you're over 45 and you've noticed that abdominal fat accumulates differently than it did in your 20s or 30s, you're observing a real metabolic shift, not imagining it. Visceral fat, the type that deposits around internal organs in the abdominal cavity, becomes more responsive to hormonal signals as we age, and importantly, more responsive to intervention when that intervention is timed correctly. There is a specific drink protocol that influences how your body processes stored fat during the overnight fasting window, and the mechanism is not speculative. It works through insulin suppression, circadian metabolic signaling, and the activation of lipolytic pathways that are most active during sleep. This is not about detoxification or flushing. This is about restoring the conditions under which your body preferentially oxidizes fat rather than storing it. What matters is understanding why it works, when to use it, and what behaviors will cancel the effect entirely. Belly fat is not simply excess energy stored in a convenient location. Subcutaneous fat, the kind you can pinch just beneath the skin, is metabolically relatively inert. It stores energy but does not actively secrete hormones or inflammatory cytokines in meaningful amounts. Visceral fat is different. It is hormonally active tissue. It releases free fatty acids directly into the portal circulation that feeds the liver. It secretes inflammatory markers, including interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha. It produces its own estrogen through aromatase activity, which disrupts hormonal balance in both men and women. It also interferes with insulin signaling in the liver and muscle tissue, which creates a feedback loop. More visceral fat leads to worse insulin sensitivity, which leads to more fat storage in the visceral compartment. This is why belly fat, once established, becomes self-reinforcing. After age 45, several metabolic changes make this pattern more pronounced. Muscle mass declines, which reduces glucose disposal capacity. Growth hormone secretion decreases, which impairs lipolysis. Cortisol rhythms flatten, meaning you maintain higher baseline cortisol throughout the day and night, which favors fat storage in the abdominal region. Insulin sensitivity declines independent of weight gain. These are not irreversible processes, but they do mean that the same behaviors that maintained your weight at 30 will not maintain it at 50. The system has changed and the intervention must be more precise. Sleep is not metabolically neutral. During the first half of the night, when slow-wave sleep dominates, growth hormone pulses occur. Growth hormone is lipolytic. It signals adipose tissue to release stored triglycerides into circulation so they can be oxidized for energy. This process is inhibited by insulin. If insulin is elevated when you go to bed, growth hormone release is blunted and fat oxidation during sleep is suppressed. The body will preferentially burn glucose and glycogen, not fat. In the second half of the night, cortisol begins to rise in preparation for waking. This is normal and necessary. However, if you go to bed in a fed state with elevated insulin, cortisol acts on a different metabolic background. Instead of mobilizing fat, it promotes muscle breakdown to generate glucose. This is why late-night eating, even if the food is not calorically excessive, disrupts body composition over time. The fuel source during sleep matters. Fat oxidation during sleep is not automatic. It requires low insulin, adequate sleep duration, and the absence of circulating glucose or amino acids that would signal the fed state. Most people go to bed in a fed state and remain there for 6 to 8 hours, which means they spend the majority of the overnight fasting window in a state that opposes fat mobilization. This is modifiable. The drink that has the most consistent evidence for supporting fat oxidation during sleep is water with added apple cider vinegar, specifically raw, unfiltered vinegar containing acetic acid at a concentration of roughly 5%. The mechanism is not mystical. Acetic acid has been shown in controlled human trials to lower postprandial glucose and insulin responses when consumed with or shortly after a meal. It does this by slowing gastric emptying and inhibiting disaccharides enzymes in the small intestine, which reduces the rate at which carbohydrates are broken down and absorbed. This means that if you consume it in the evening after your last meal, it blunts the insulin spike that would otherwise occur, shortening the duration of the fed state and allowing you to enter a fasted, fat-oxidizing state more quickly. Acetic acid also activates AMPK, an enzyme that functions as a cellular energy sensor. When AMPK is activated, it promotes fat oxidation and inhibits fat synthesis. It does this by phosphorylating acetyl-CoA carboxylase, the rate-limiting enzyme in fatty acid synthesis, effectively turning off the production of new fat while turning on the breakdown of stored fat. There is also evidence that acetic acid improves insulin sensitivity independent of weight loss, which means it addresses one of the core metabolic dysfunctions that drives visceral fat accumulation in the first place. In a 12-week study published in Bioscience, Biotechnology, and Biochemistry, participants who consumed 15 milliliters of vinegar daily experienced significant reductions in body weight, visceral fat area, and waist circumference compared to controls, even without changes in diet or exercise. The effect was modest but measurable, and it occurred specifically in the visceral compartment, not subcutaneous fat. The protocol is straightforward: 1 to 2 tablespoons of raw apple cider vinegar diluted in 8 to 12 ounces of water, consumed 30 to 60 minutes after your last meal of the day. This timing is critical. If you drink it too early, the effect on postprandial insulin is wasted. If you drink it too late, close to bedtime, the acidity may cause reflux or disrupt sleep, which negates the metabolic benefit. The goal is to lower insulin as quickly as possible after eating so that by the time you lie down, you are already transitioning into a fasted state. The drink should not contain added sweeteners, honey, lemon juice with sugar, or any other source of calories. Even small amounts of sugar will trigger an insulin response and cancel the effect. The vinegar should be raw and unfiltered because the mother, the cloudy sediment in the bottle, contains beneficial bacteria and enzymes that may support gut health, though the primary metabolic effect comes from the acetic acid itself. Dilution is not optional. Undiluted vinegar can damage tooth enamel and irritate the esophagus. Some people prefer to drink it through a straw to minimize contact with teeth, which is reasonable. The water itself also matters. Adequate hydration supports lipolysis and helps the kidneys excrete metabolic waste products generated during fat oxidation. Drinking this before bed ensures you maintain hydration throughout the night without needing to wake to urinate, assuming your last fluid intake is not excessive. This drink does not burn fat on its own. It does not create a caloric deficit. It does not override poor dietary choices, chronic sleep deprivation, or a sedentary lifestyle. What it does is create a more favorable hormonal environment for fat oxidation during the hours when fat oxidation should naturally occur. If you consume this drink and then eat a bowl of cereal or a protein shake before bed, you have negated the insulin-lowering effect entirely. If you drink alcohol in the evening, fat oxidation stops completely while your liver prioritizes ethanol metabolism, and the acetic acid will do nothing to change that. If you eat dinner at 9 p.m. and go to bed at 10, you are still in a fed state regardless of what you drink afterward. The drink works as part of a system, not as a standalone intervention. It is a tool that makes the fasted state more accessible, but it does not replace the fasted state. The most common mistake is assuming that healthy nighttime snacks are metabolically neutral. A handful of almonds, a piece of fruit, a protein bar, or a small serving of yogurt are all marketed as reasonable evening snacks, and in terms of micronutrients or satiety, they may be fine, but metabolically, they restart the insulin clock. Every time you eat, insulin rises. Every time insulin rises, fat oxidation stops. If your goal is to maximize fat oxidation during sleep, any calorie intake after dinner is counterproductive, regardless of the macronutrient composition. Another mistake is drinking beverages that seem benign but contain hidden sugars or insulin-stimulating compounds. Herbal teas with added flavoring, electrolyte drinks with dextrose, protein shakes, and even some brands of flavored sparkling water contain enough carbohydrate to spike insulin. Read labels. If it has calories, it has an insulin effect. Alcohol is particularly disruptive. Even one glass of wine suppresses fat oxidation for hours, independent of its caloric content. Alcohol is metabolized as a toxin, and the liver prioritizes its clearance above all other fuel sources. This means stored fat remains stored, and any dietary fat consumed with alcohol is more likely to be deposited rather than oxidized. If you drink alcohol regularly in the evening, no nighttime protocol will be effective. The final mistake is inconsistency. Using this drink occasionally or only when you remember will not produce a measurable change. The metabolic adaptations that improve insulin sensitivity and promote fat oxidation occur with repeated exposure over weeks, not days. If you want to see a reduction in waist circumference or visceral fat area, the protocol must be followed nightly, and it must be paired with an eating window that ends at least 3 hours before bed. There is one additional factor that most discussions of nighttime fat loss ignore, and it is more powerful than most people realize. Light exposure after sunset disrupts circadian insulin sensitivity. Your body's ability to process glucose and regulate insulin is not static throughout the day. It follows a circadian rhythm with peak insulin sensitivity in the morning and declining sensitivity as the day progresses. This is why eating the same meal at 8 a.m. versus 8 p.m. produces different metabolic responses. Bright light, especially blue light from screens, signals to your brain that it is still daytime, which delays the onset of melatonin and disrupts the metabolic shift that should occur in the evening. Melatonin is not just a sleep hormone, it also modulates insulin secretion. When melatonin rises, insulin sensitivity decreases, which is why late-night eating is so metabolically damaging. If you are exposed to bright light late into the evening, your melatonin rise is delayed, but your insulin sensitivity still declines on schedule, meaning you are eating in a window where your body is least equipped to handle glucose. This creates a perfect environment for fat storage. Reducing light exposure after sunset, dimming screens, using blue blocking glasses, or simply turning off overhead lights and using lamps instead can meaningfully improve your metabolic response to evening meals and enhance fat oxidation during sleep. This is not about sleep quality alone. This is about aligning your light exposure with your metabolic rhythm so that your body is prepared to enter a fasted, fat-burning state when you lie down. If you are over 45 and you have noticed that belly fat no longer responds to the strategies that worked when you were younger, you are not experiencing an irreversible decline. You are experiencing a system that has become more sensitive to timing, more sensitive to insulin, and more dependent on circadian alignment. The drink protocol works because it addresses insulin directly at the time of day when insulin suppression matters most. It works because it shortens the fed state and allows you to spend more of the night in a fat oxidizing state. It works because it is simple, repeatable, and requires no special equipment or expensive supplements. But it works only when used correctly, consistently, and as part of a broader framework that respects the biology of fat metabolism. Visceral fat is not permanent. It is highly responsive to metabolic intervention when that intervention is precise. You are not powerless here. You are working with a system that follows rules, and once you understand the rules, the system becomes predictable.